My view on net zero is that trying to get there at some point in the future is no bad thing. But, and this is the really critical point, we should never, ever put net zero ahead of saving jobs, keeping industries and protecting people's standard of living.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail.
Hello, welcome to Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. My name is John Roskam. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. Tony, there's so much to talk about. Let's get straight into it. We last spoke 2 weeks ago. What's just happened?
Well, we've obviously had a week of convulsions on the Conservative side of politics, with the coalition first breaking and now apparently reforming. I'm a strong coalitionist, John. I used to say, when I was back in Parliament, I'd say that a Liberal is a city national and a national is a country Liberal. Now, a lot of my Liberal colleagues in particular would take umbrage at that, because some of them have never that much liked the National Party. They think it's a too conservative drag on the liberalism of the Liberal Party. But nevertheless, with John Howard, I have always thought that the Liberal Party and the National Party succeed together and fail separately. So I was dismayed when the coalition did briefly break up last week. I hope that it can get together again as quickly as possible. I'm confident that it will get together as quickly as possible, because I think both sides looked over the brink. They saw the rocks below and they decided, no, this isn't smart. So I think that we're in a better place now than we were a week ago.
A couple of weeks on from the election, what further reflections do you have now that, and we'll talk further about the coalition, we'll talk further about the future of the Liberal Party and moderates versus conservatives. Have you had any further thoughts since we last spoke about the election and its results?
Well, obviously, in the immediate aftermath, we weren't quite as conscious of the scale of the defeat.
How bad it was.
When we last spoke, it looked like Labor had maybe 85, 88 seats. Now it looks like they're going to have 93, 94 seats. It's a very, very big win. Now, let's put it in context. Labor got 34% of the vote, so it's in a sense a loveless landslide. Nevertheless, it is a very big win, and it does justify a lot of soul searching on our side of politics, and it is going to be hard to come back, because essentially we are going to need, going into the next election, 40 good candidates for 40 seats. And quite apart from the national campaign, we're going to have 40 strong local campaigns to ensure that we get from something like 43 or 44 seats now up to the 76 plus that you need to form a majority government. So it's a big defeat, but I'm also more conscious than ever of just how winnable the election was if we'd campaigned harder on energy and had been more robust in our defence of nuclear, if we had campaigned hard on Labor's bad policies like the unrealised capital gains tax, which is essentially a wealth tax, I think it could have been a very different result. But the disappointing thing about it all, and this is a collective failure, I certainly don't put all the blame on Peter Dutton, although Peter decently and honourably did take full responsibility. Our collective failure was to fight. There was just not enough fight in our team. We'd done very well in the run-up to the new year. A majority of people told pollsters that the government didn't deserve to be re-elected. But there are two questions that people ask going into an election. The first question is, does the government deserve to be re-elected? And I think the answer clearly was no. And then they ask this second question, is the opposition ready to govern? And that was where we failed. And we failed because we gave up the relentless opposition to a bad government. And at the same time as we throttled back on that, it became apparent that we hadn't done adequate work on policy. For instance, we'd said repeatedly that we wanted to see a substantial cut in immigration, but we never released a formal immigration policy. We'd said repeatedly that we wanted to go to education, not indoctrination in our schools. By the time we released an education policy, it was about 36 hours before polling day, and it didn't really talk about the curriculum changes that we'd earlier said were important. So there was a failure to get our act together at the critical stages of the campaign. Now, I suppose the leader and the leader's office has got to take some responsibility for that. Individual shadows have got to take some responsibility for that. Either the shadows hadn't done the work and that's their fault, or they had done the work and it didn't get released. Well, again, that's partly their fault because shadows aren't flunkies. Shadow ministers should be prepared to stand up to the leader on important subjects and say, look, we've done the work, we've got to put it out. Now, I was talking to one shadow during the campaign who should remain nameless, and I said, so where's your policy? And he said, well, it's gone up on the website. And I said, oh, that's good. And he said, I wanted to have a press conference and make a big song and dance about it, but I was told by campaign headquarters no. Well, if someone is sufficiently trustworthy and competent to be a shadow minister, that person should be sufficiently trustworthy and competent to have a press conference
and
during an election
presumably
campaign.
this person is competent enough to be a minister if Dutton was to be elected.
Correct. The person in question has been quite a senior minister in the past.
So, guys, I couldn't agree with you more about the coalition fighting. Can I put to you that that lack of fight is a symptom of a much bigger problem that goes beyond the failures of the campaign. So the ability or lack thereof to fight on net zero is because the moderates and conservatives can't agree. You've got a debate about education. You've had some Liberal MPs and senators saying, well, education isn't a significant issue. You can't have a debate about immigration because there are some who still favour a bigger, larger Australia, even though there's no houses for the immigrants. Isn't that lack of fight a symptom of the lack of ability internally for the Liberals to agree amongst themselves? And let's then take net zero as the best example of that.
Well, let's get on to net zero in a second. But John, all political parties that aspire to be parties of government are the proverbial broad church. And the Liberal Party will always have people in it who are more conservative, people in it who are more liberal, people in it who are more progressive. The important thing is for the party to be able to unite around a clear set of policies. And if I may say so, the best and the quickest way to unite the Liberal Party is to attack the Labor Party. All Liberals will agree that the Labor Party is wrong, and that's why attacking the Labor Party is the best way to unite the Liberal Party. And this is why it was so inexplicable that there wasn't a strong attack on Labor's unrealised capital gains tax policy pre-election, and why even now the best way to kick off this period of opposition the right way would be to mount a savage, ferocious attack on this terrible policy, which is effectively a wealth tax, because the only people in favour of it are the class war warriors, even people who are normally on the Labor side, union officials like Michael Eason, for instance, people like Bernie Fraser, former Reserve Bank governor, who's basically a man of the left. They are saying this is a crazy tax, a crazy, crazy tax. So were we to mount a major campaign now against this tax, it's quite possible we could force the government to back down, as Peter Reith once forced the Hawke government to back down over the Australia card. But even if that wasn't possible and it does go through the Parliament, for the rest of this term, that tax on unearned income will be a sign of what Labor will do, if it can, in terms of soaking the rich, in terms of attacking people's wealth. What comes next? Is it an inheritance tax or a death tax? Is it capital gains tax on the family home? I mean, once this dam has been broken, you never know where the waters are going to rush, given that this is a government which is addicted to spending, and while they don't mind debt and deficit stretching as far as the eye can see, eventually they are going to have to take money out of our pockets to pay for it. So the best way to unite the Liberal Party is to successfully attack the Labor Party, and that's where it all starts.
So I'm all for attacking the Labor Party, but doesn't that paper over the cracks? Doesn't it avoid the difficult discussions about what the Liberal Party believes in? So you're a Conservative, however defined. John Howard, Conservative. You won elections. Sometimes there's no meeting in the middle. There was no meeting in the middle on The Voice. It's yes or no. Net zero, it's yes or no. You either believe in freedom of speech, yes or no. So isn't this part of the Liberal problem, that we assume everything can be made subject to consensus, when sometimes you have to take a stand? You did, John Howard did, you won elections.
Well, you're right, John. I mean, in the end, the search for consensus will usually produce a weak fudge. The only way to achieve consensus is normally after the event, through success. Now, there is, it seems, a consensus now on border protection policies, at least when it comes to turning boats around and sending boat people straight back. That wasn't the Labor Party's position when they were in government. They ferociously opposed the policies of the then Abbott opposition and the then Abbott government until they'd worked, and then they said, okay, well, we sort of support them. So look, you're right. Seeking consensus in advance when dealing with difficult problems is kind of a wild goose chase. Let's talk about net zero. I think it was a mistake for the Morrison government to sign up to net zero. I've never had this discussion with its key people. Maybe it's something that should be explored, but I've always kind of assumed that the reason why Scott signed up to net zero was because it was the price of getting the AUKUS agreement out of Boris Johnson.
There seems to be
Joe
a widespread
Biden.
assumption that it was Boris who forced it upon Morrison.
And if that were the case, I can understand why he did it, because frankly, AUKUS was and remains incredibly important. And sometimes to get a lot, you've got to give a bit. So I can understand it if that was the reason behind it. But we are now in a different place. AUKUS is happening too slowly, but it is nevertheless happening. And we're now 5 years down the track. And what's increasingly obvious is that the countries that count are not committed to net zero. China says it might get to net zero in 2060. India says it might get to net zero in 2070. Russia's never talked about net zero. And now the United States has abandoned Paris and any notion of getting to net zero anytime soon.
Tony Blair in the
Tony
UK,
Blair says,
New Zealand, the same.
Yeah, Tony Blair says that net zero is a dreadful mistake. So look, my view on net zero is that trying to get there at some point in the future is no bad thing. But, and this is the really critical point, we should never, ever put net zero ahead of saving jobs, keeping industries, and protecting people's standard of living. So net zero, fine, but let's not put a timeline on it, and let's not damage our people in the process, given that no one else is going to damage their people in the process. I mean, net zero has been used, particularly by China, as a vehicle for economically damaging the West. And as Donald Trump's energy secretary, incoming energy secretary, said, there is no climate crisis and there is no energy transition. So why should we in Australia pretend that there is a climate crisis, and why should we be driving an energy transition which is imperiling our long-term economic future and in the short term doing massive damage to household budgets? I mean, look at the sheer expense of the so-called green transition. I mean, at the beginning of Labor's term in 2022, Chris Bowen likened the energy transition to a second industrial revolution. He said, and this is back in 2022, we're going to have to put 22,000 new solar panels in every day. We're going to have to build 40 large wind turbines every single month. And then he said, and we'll have to build somewhere between 10 and 28,000 kilometres of new transmission lines. Even the extra transmission lines back then in 2022 was costed at $80 billion. Given that the costs have at least doubled, that's, let's say, $160, $200 billion just for the transmission lines, let alone all the infrastructure required to harness the power, let alone all the firming required to ensure that we have electricity 24/7, not just when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And this is the other crazy thing about this so-called green transition. To make renewable power work, you need gas, because gas is the only really feasible form of energy that can be turned on and off momentarily. Coal-fired power takes quite a while to ramp up and down. I think the same is largely true of nuclear as well. It can't sort of go from off to fully on in a matter of moments. So look, gas is absolutely essential, but no new gas fields have been opened under the current government. Even if the government is semi in favour, and it's hard to tell listening to the government, we've got all these government-funded green groups which are engaging in constant lawfare against every new gas field. We've got the government sitting on perhaps the biggest single decision, whether to approve an extension for the Northwest Shelf gas project. This is a $30 billion project. I mean, this is absolutely essential, not just for our economic future, but for the energy security of places like Japan and Taiwan. So look, I mean, I just think that we are facing a real economic crisis, and if we don't lift our game, and it's very hard to see us lifting our game under the current government, we really are on the Argentine path.
So these are all, to me, very strong reasons to end any commitment to net zero, and we haven't even talked about the science of climate change. So for me as a layperson and as a Liberal Party member, how do you explain the Liberal Party's continued adherence to it? And then I'll ask you to also, if you'd like to, talk about the National Party, because the net zero was not one of the National Party's four key demands of the Liberals. So we can argue about those four demands and whether they were valid or not. But to most people, the single most important policy question facing us right now, net zero, is not being discussed between the coalition partners.
Well, John, the reason why some significant elements in the Liberal Party support net zero is because they think that it would be politically damaging not to. They think that the public, at least in seats that they're familiar with, are ferociously in favour of net zero. And I can certainly remember the 2019 campaign in Warringah, which I lost. I had schoolgirls coming up to me literally in tears saying that because of my energy policies, they'd all be dead in 10 or 12 years' time and the planet would be destroyed. Look, there is no doubt that the climate catastrophism that we've seen over the last decade or so has persuaded a lot of people, including a lot of people who don't think much about these things, that something must be happening and that something should be done, and that net zero seems to be a good way of going forward because that's what everyone in inverted commas seems to want. But the truth is that if the climate is altering, it's altering very slowly, and I think it's far from certain that mankind's carbon dioxide is the sole or even the main climate factor, climate villain, if you like. I mean, something that I've often asked the climate zealots to explain is how did we get the Ice Age, given that that was palpable and massive climate change and had absolutely nothing to do with human beings. So plainly there are very significant factors on the climate that have nothing to do with humankind. I went to a lecture some years ago by a very prominent Israeli physicist who reckoned that if you wanted to find a strong correlation between weather trends and any particular factor, by far the strongest correlation was with sunspot activity. And I've got to say, that strikes me as a lot more plausible, given the fact that the most obvious impact on what's happening here on Earth is the sun. Is it getting stronger? Is it getting weaker? Is it getting closer? Is it getting further away? That's the obvious main impact on temperature here on Earth. So look, I'm unconvinced about the anthropogenic global warming thesis, and I'm certainly completely opposed to anything which damages our economies, because regardless of what's happening to climate, by far the most important thing is to be able to adapt and be resilient in the face of whatever comes, and the wealthier we are, the more adaptable and resilient inevitably will be.
So can I ask you then to cast your mind forward, what will be the process of change in the same way that Australians will understand net zero is unaffordable and has many other issues with it? What will be the process of change in the coalition to start to walk away from net zero?
Well, plainly, the National Party is more sceptical about all of this than the Liberal Party, and I suspect that at some point in time, the National Party will decide that net zero by 2050 is not a policy goal they wish to persist with. And I suppose it would then be a question of having that debate inside the joint party room, inside the shadow cabinet.
It's a debate you've seen a few times.
Look, I have. And plainly, in the last parliament, it was the National Party that was first committed to opposing the voice, and it was the National Party that was first committed to supporting nuclear energy, and eventually those policies were adopted by the coalition. And I think that opposing the voice was a no-brainer, and it was certainly massively vindicated by the public at the referendum. I still think support for nuclear energy is a no-brainer. I mean, how can we as a country be in favour of nuclear energy on submarines and not be in favour of nuclear energy on the other side of the dock? I mean, if nuclear energy is safe and affordable in boats, submarines, why isn't it safe and affordable for civil purposes as well? I just think there's no real objection to that, other than an objection that's motivated entirely in ideology or some sense that a nuclear power plant can blow up like a bomb, which it can't.
Let's assume the coalition comes back together in some form. We cast our mind forward 3 years. The coalition is going to need a higher primary vote than the 32% it got 3 weeks ago. You got a 45% primary vote and then some 90 seats. How does the coalition bring back those forgotten people, the politically homeless? So I appeared on a wonderful podcast from the Robert Menzies Institute with Georgina Downer, and with Zach Gorman I spoke about the fact that the Liberal Party said nothing about censorship during the election. It said, as you said, very little on education, even though Sarah Henderson had a good policy. It said nothing about misinformation. It said nothing about the cultural challenges we're facing. If, like me, you believe these things are just as important, if not more important, than fixing the budget, how do I vote?
Well, if you look at the total vote for the broad left and compare it with the total vote for the broad right, it was still kind of 45%, maybe 48% for the broad right versus 55, maybe 52% for the broad left. So people who in the most recent election voted for One Nation or the Palmer Party or Conservative Independents, we need to get a much bigger percentage of those people coming back to us. And then we need to get some current Labor voters to come to us. Now, I think back to Thatcher's blue-collar Tories, to the Reagan Democrats, to the Howard Battlers, to Tony's tradies. And there are plenty of working class people who are more than ready to vote for the conservative side of politics if they think that it has not just sensible economic policies but decent social policies. And I think back to my time as the employment minister in the Howard government, where I was most responsible for the work for the dole scheme. Now, the number of people who were working in relatively low-paid jobs, shop assistants, council workers, people like that, who come up to me and say, Tony, good on you for work for the dole, because I know people in my street who are on unemployment benefits and frankly they're just bludging. And if you're working hard, not earning much money, paying taxes, and you're seeing your taxes ripped off by people who frankly should be doing more for themselves, you get understandably resentful. And I really think that an important part of a more just society is ending the something for nothing mindset. I mean, just at the moment, for instance, you've got a lot of people looking at the NDIS, and I think all of us reckon that really seriously disabled people should obviously get the best possible go. But should we really be paying $50 an hour to take teenagers with developmental issues to the movies, for instance, under the NDIS? Should we really be funding holidays and what have you for people under the NDIS? Now, I'm not saying that the mechanics of changing these policies are necessarily all that easy, but it ought to be possible for a Liberal National Coalition which does the work over the next 3 years to come up with a better way of running the NDIS, to come up with better ways of running our social security system, to come up with ways of not just funding industrialised childcare, industrialised aged care, industrialised disability care, but better supporting families to do some of these things themselves. And then again, we get to the basic issue. The first law of government should be, in fact, the first law of politics should be kind of a political version of the Hippocratic Oath: first, do no harm. And I would have thought, going into the election we've just had, that the coalition's industrial relations policy would simply have been to repeal all the industrial changes that the Albanese government had made, because they were all bad. I couldn't see any that were good. And certainly the previous coalition government, other than restoring the Australian Building and Construction Commission, had essentially continued the position of the Rudd-Gillard government. So if it was good enough for the Rudd-Gillard government, it's hardly oppressive to the workers of Australia. So let's get rid of all of the stuff that the Albanese government has put in, which is obviously contributing to the collapse of productivity and obviously making it harder for people to run their business, particularly small business people run their businesses. So I have no doubt that it's possible to go into the next election with a collection of policies which common sense people, decent, patriotic Australians would be prepared to support as a preferable alternative to what the Albanese government is doing, given that almost certainly there'll be a lot more harm that the Albanese government does over the next 3 years.
Since the election, there's been discussion about the MPs, the coalition MPs who've lost their seats. There's been a lot of analysis of the campaign. What are your reflections on losing an election, even though your election loss was a moral victory? Have you spoken to these MPs? Have you spoken about how to deal with life after politics?
The short answer is I've spoken to some. I certainly haven't spoken to all. And the truth is that if you have just suffered a major rebuff in your life, whether it's losing your job, losing your family, confronting a major illness, something like that, it takes time to process. And I suspect that most of them, from Peter Dutton down, are just feeling numb.
How long? Weeks, days, years?
Well, I think back to losing the Prime Ministership, and then I think back to losing my own seat in Parliament. And there's a sense in which 10 years on from losing the Prime Ministership and 5 years on from losing my seat, I'm still processing
Was
these
it any
things.
consolation that people said you made your best speech of your life losing Warringah?
Yeah, look, that was one of those nights when the inspiration really came, I've got to say. It was a pretty dire event, but I did manage to turn defeat into a kind of victory with a very good speech. Look, it takes a long time to get over these things, and in a sense you are always different from having lived through it. Now they say, and I think there's something in this, that you learn more from your defeats than from your victories, from your failures than from your successes. And certainly failure can be very instructive. But in the case of someone going from the Prime Ministership, from the Prime Ministership to not, obviously, other than Bob Menzies and Kevin Rudd, you're never going to go back. So there's a sense in which that exultant, triumphant period of your life is gone forever, and you'll always have a sense of loss.
How do you deal with it? Do you think about the good things that you did? Is it managing regret? Is it thinking, well, there are people much worse than I am? What are some of the things that people go through?
All of those things, John. I mean, it's a good rule in life to count your blessings, and at least if you're living in Australia, your blessings invariably outweigh things to complain and gristle about. And I suppose another good rule in life is to look at others who are worse off and say, well, let's be grateful. So yeah, you do all of that, and then I suppose you look to other things that you can do and make the most of them.
Do you feel freed up? Was there any sense that, okay, I'm not in Parliament, I'm not the Prime Minister, but now I can maybe do something different and speak my mind?
There's no doubt, John, that while you are a party leader, particularly while you're a Prime Minister, you have got to be a little bit guarded in what you say, because words can be bullets. They certainly have consequences particularly if the words you speak are regarded as binding for a political movement or indeed for a country. And look at the way Donald Trump's every musing
Every tweet
can reverberate around the world just now. So there's no doubt that as a former Prime Minister, you have vastly more freedom to speak your mind, and you are, in a sense, unconstrained in a way that you were sometimes a little constrained in office. You can be a little braver, perhaps. You can push out the bounds of what is acceptable political discourse more readily in retirement from public office than you could while you were there. So look, all of us, I think, are directed by our Maker to make a difference and to be our best selves whilstsoever we are in this vale of tears.
Final question for this discussion today. Chart the course of the centre-right of Australian politics, not just for the next 3 years to the next election, but for the next 5 in the context of the tumult we've seen in the last 2 weeks.
Well, again, you've got to ask yourself, what do we really stand for? And the Liberal Party, to use a Howardism, is a broad church. I mean, John always used to say that the Liberal Party is the political custodian in this country of the J.S. Mill Liberal tradition and the Edmund Burke Conservative tradition. My way of putting it was to say that we are Liberals in that we believe in smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. We're Conservatives in that we support the family, small business and institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, we're Patriots in that we think this is the best country in the world to live, and we are determined to keep it that way. So I think as long as we remember that we are the Freedom Party, the Tradition Party, but above all else the Patriotic Party, we'll do pretty well.
Tony Abbott, thank you for being with us on Australia's Future.
Thanks, John.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.